In a crowded San Diego coffee shop, a group of college students thought they'd found the perfect target for their morning entertainment. The quiet barista with the rolled-up sleeves revealing what looked like a fake military tattoo seemed like an easy mark. They had no idea that their jokes about her wannabe Navy ink would soon turn into the most humbling experience of their lives. Because sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most ordinary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for youth. Pacific Coast Cafe buzzed with its usual morning energy as Stella Cooper methodically prepared the espresso machine for another busy day. At 29, she moved through her opening routine with a precision that most customers never noticed. Every motion calculated, every step purposeful, every detail checked twice. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her understated appearance allowed her to blend seamlessly into the background of San Diego's bustling coffee culture. For the past 8 months, Stella had worked the morning shift at this particular cafe, chosen specifically for its location, 3 blocks from the Naval Base San Diego. The steady stream of sailors, civilians, and students created the perfect environment for someone who preferred to observe rather than be observed. She'd mastered the art of being simultaneously present and invisible, always ready to help, never drawing attention to herself. The small anchor tattoo on her left forearm usually remained hidden beneath her long-sleeved work shirt. But on particularly warm California mornings like this one, she'd roll up her sleeves just enough to stay comfortable while working the espresso machine. The design was simple, a traditional naval anchor in deep blue ink, with what appeared to be coordinates, and a small trident symbol beneath it. To most people, it looked like standard military-themed body art, the kind of tattoo thousands of people got to show support for the armed forces or to commemorate a family member's service. Stella had chosen this particular coffee shop for several reasons. The location provided excellent sight lines to 3 major intersections, 2 bus stops, and the main pedestrian route to the naval base. The large windows allowed natural surveillance of the surrounding area, while the position behind the counter gave her a clear view of everyone who entered or left. These weren't conscious thoughts anymore. They were simply the way her mind processed any new environment. The morning rush typically started around 0630 hours, bringing a predictable mix of early commuters, fitness enthusiasts heading to the nearby gym, and naval personnel grabbing coffee before their shifts. Stella had memorized the patterns. Commander Patricia Hayes always ordered a large black coffee at 0645. Petty Officer Johnson preferred his cappuccino extra hot, and a group of nurses from the nearby hospital invariably arrived at 0715, laughing and chatting about their night shifts. But this Tuesday morning brought an unfamiliar element to her carefully observed routine. A group of 5 college students, probably from UC San Diego based on their clothing and conversation, had claimed the large corner table near the window. They were the type of customers Stella typically found most challenging, loud, entitled, and convinced that their youth gave them license to comment on everything and everyone around them. "I swear this place has the slowest service," complained Brandon Mitchell, a business major whose father's credit card funded his caffeine addiction. He was the obvious leader of the group, the one who set the tone for their interactions with the world around them. "How hard is it to make a simple latte?" His girlfriend, Ashley Chun, scrolled through her phone while adding her own commentary. "At least the barista's kind of cute in that whole, I don't try too hard way. Very authentic San Diego vibe." The third member of their group, Tyler Rodriguez, had been studying for an economics exam, but kept getting distracted by their conversation. "You guys realize she can probably hear you, right? We're like 10 feet away from the counter." "So what?" laughed Jessica Wong, adjusting her designer sunglasses despite being indoors. "We're customers. We're allowed to have opinions." The fifth student, Marcus Thompson, seemed less comfortable with the group's behavior, but hadn't found the courage to speak up. He'd grown up in a military family, and something about their casual dismissiveness toward the staff made him uneasy. Though he couldn't quite articulate why, Stella continued her work, seemingly oblivious to their chatter, but she'd catalog each of their voices, their seating positions, and their general demeanor within the first 30 seconds of their arrival. It was automatic now, the kind of situational awareness that had been drilled into her during years of training that these students couldn't even imagine. The morning rush intensified as more customers filtered in, creating the familiar symphony of grinding coffee beans, steaming milk, and overlapping conversations. Stella moved through her tasks with fluid efficiency, taking orders, preparing drinks, and maintaining the delicate dance of peak-hour service. Her movements were economical and precise, no wasted energy, no unnecessary motion. "Large Americano, 2 shots," she called out, sliding the cup across the counter to a regular customer, who nodded his thanks and disappeared back into the street. The college students had been nursing their drinks for over an hour now, their conversation growing louder and more animated as their table became increasingly cluttered with textbooks, laptops, and empty pastry plates. Stella noticed that Brandon kept glancing in her direction, and she could sense the building energy that often preceded some kind of confrontation or commentary. "Medium cappuccino with oat milk," Stella announced, preparing the next order in her cue. Her voice carried just enough volume to be heard over the ambient noise, but never more than necessary. Everything about her public persona was carefully modulated to project competence, without commanding attention. As she worked, Stella found herself thinking about how different this environment was from her previous assignments. 8 months ago, her daily routine had involved considerably higher stakes than perfecting latte art and managing inventory. The transition from her former life to civilian employment had been more challenging than she'd anticipated, not because the work was difficult, but because the hypervigilance that had kept her alive in hostile environments was difficult to dial down in peaceful settings. The anchor tattoo on her forearm caught the morning sunlight streaming through the cafe windows, and Stella noticed Brandon's attention focus on it with increasing interest. She'd been careful to keep it covered during her first few months of employment, but as the weather warmed and her comfort level in this environment increased, she'd become less concerned about its visibility. What Brandon and his friends couldn't know was that the seemingly simple design contained information that would be meaningless to civilians but instantly recognizable to certain members of the military community. The coordinates beneath the anchor marked a specific location in the Arabian Sea where a classified operation had taken place 3 years earlier. The small trident wasn't decorative. It was an operational designation that appeared in no public records and was known only to a select group of Naval Special Operations personnel. "Hey, check out Military Barbie over there," Brandon said, his voice carrying clearly across the small space. "Someone's really committed to the whole support our troops aesthetic." Ashley looked up from her phone, following his gaze to Stella's exposed forearm. "Oh wow, that's so cliché. Like, we get it, you're patriotic. But did you really need to get a tattoo to prove it?" The comment drew snickers from Jessica and uncomfortable silence from Marcus, who was beginning to wish he'd chosen a different study group. Tyler continued reading his textbook, but Stella noticed his shoulders tense slightly at the escalating nature of the conversation. What none of them realized was that Stella had been monitoring their discussion from the moment they'd arrived. Years of training had taught her to track multiple conversations simultaneously while maintaining focus on her primary tasks. She'd identified Brandon as the instigator, Ashley as the amplifier, Jessica as the follower, Tyler as the reluctant participant, and Marcus as the potential ally if the situation deteriorated. The cafe's atmosphere remained normal. For everyone else, the regular customers continued their routines, unaware of the building tension at the corner table. "Commander Hayes finished," her black coffee, and left with her usual efficient nod. The group of nurses arrived precisely on schedule, bringing their familiar energy and laughter to brighten the morning rush, but Stella could feel the shift in dynamics as clearly as if someone had announced it over a loudspeaker. Brandon was working up to something, and his friends were either encouraging him or failing to discourage him. The combination of youthful arrogance, group dynamics, and boredom was creating a situation that could easily escalate beyond simple rudeness. She'd handled far more dangerous situations with less preparation, but those had been in environments where the rules of engagement were clearly defined. Here, in this peaceful coffee shop filled with innocent civilians, the parameters were entirely different. Her training demanded that she assess threats and respond appropriately. But what constituted an appropriate response when the threat was nothing more than entitled college students with too much time and too little wisdom? As Stella steamed milk for another cappuccino, she caught Brandon pointing directly at her tattoo and making exaggerated gestures to his friends. Whatever he was planning, it was about to begin, and she found herself mentally shifting into a more alert state while maintaining the appearance of casual indifference. The morning rush was beginning to slow, leaving fewer customers as buffers between Stella and the increasingly bold commentary from the corner table. Soon, they would either lose interest and leave, or Brandon would find the courage to make his move. Based on his body language and the encouragement he was receiving from Ashley and Jessica, Stella suspected she knew which direction this was heading. 8 months of peaceful routine were about to be interrupted. And despite all her training and experience, Stella wasn't entirely sure she was prepared for the kind of engagement that required her to remain professional while being personally attacked by people who had no idea what they were dealing with. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Brandon Mitchell finished his third refill and pushed back from the table with the kind of theatrical confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. His economics textbook lay forgotten as he focused entirely on what he'd decided was the morning's entertainment. The anchor tattoo on Stella's forearm had captured his attention, and now he was determined to prove a point to his friends about what he saw as obvious military posturing. "You know what really gets me?" he announced, loud enough for most of the cafe to hear. "People who get military tattoos when they've never even been close to actual service. It's like stolen valor, but with ink." Ashley giggled, encouraging. "His performance, right? Like, if you're going to fake military service, at least make it believable. That anchor looks like something you'd get at a strip mall tattoo parlor." Tyler finally looked up from his textbook, recognizing that his study group was about to create a scene that would reflect poorly on all of them. "Maybe we should just focus on our own stuff," he suggested quietly, but his voice was lost in Brandon's. Building momentum. Jessica leaned forward conspiratorially. "I bet she tells people her boyfriend is deployed or something. You know, for the sympathy points and free drinks." Marcus Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his military upbringing making him increasingly uneasy with the direction of the conversation. His father had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and his older brother was currently stationed in Norfolk. He knew enough about military culture to recognize that making assumptions about someone's service record was dangerous territory. "Guys, seriously," Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning note that his friends chose to ignore. "Maybe we don't know the whole story here." But Brandon was already standing up, energized by the attention he was receiving and the opportunity to demonstrate his wit in front of Ashley. He'd consumed enough caffeine to feel invincible, and just enough social validation to believe his commentary was not only appropriate but clever. Stella continued preparing drinks with mechanical precision, but her peripheral vision tracked every movement at the corner table. She'd identified the escalation pattern: Brandon's increasing volume, Ashley's encouraging laughter, Jessica's supportive commentary, and most importantly, the growing discomfort of Tyler and Marcus. In hostile environments, understanding group dynamics could mean the difference between a peaceful resolution and a dangerous confrontation. The cafe had emptied considerably since the morning rush, leaving only a handful of customers scattered throughout the space. An elderly man read his newspaper near the window, completely absorbed in the sports section. Two women in their 40s discussed weekend plans while sharing a breakfast pastry. A young professional typed frantically on his laptop, earbuds blocking out the world around him. None of them had any awareness of the building tension. "Excuse me, miss," Brandon called out, approaching the counter with exaggerated politeness that fooled no one. "I was just wondering about your ink there. That's a really interesting take on military symbolism." Stella looked up from the espresso machine, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. Her expression remained neutral, professional, giving. "Nothing away. Can I get you another drink?" she asked, her voice steady and unremarkable. "Actually, I'm curious about the story behind that anchor," Brandon pressed, pointing at her forearm. "Did you design it yourself, or is it supposed to represent something specific?" The question drew the attention of the remaining customers, who began to sense that something uncomfortable was developing. The elderly man glanced up from his newspaper, his expression suggesting he'd witnessed this kind of confrontation before, and didn't approve. The two women stopped their conversation, exchanging concerned glances. "It's personal," Stella replied simply, turning back to her work. Her response was measured, offering neither encouragement nor escalation, but Brandon interpreted her brevity as evasion. "Personal, right?" he said with a smirk. "Look, I'm not trying to be difficult here, but that whole military aesthetic is pretty played out, especially when it's obviously fake." Ashley had moved closer to the counter, drawn by the unfolding drama. "The coordinates are a nice touch," she added. "Very authentic looking. Did you just pick random numbers, or do they actually go somewhere?" Stella's hands continued their methodical work, but something subtle shifted in her posture. The coordinates weren't random. They marked a specific location in the Arabian Sea where she'd spent 3 weeks conducting surveillance on enemy shipping routes. The operation had been classified at the highest levels, known only to the 12 personnel directly involved and a handful of commanding officers who'd planned the mission. "They're not random," Stella said quietly, still focused on her tasks. Brandon laughed, the sound carrying more aggression than humor. "Right, of course they're not. Let me guess. They mark some super important military location that you definitely can't talk about because it's classified?" The mockery in his voice was unmistakable, and several customers were now openly watching the interaction. The elderly man had folded his newspaper and was studying the scene with increasing concern. The professional with the laptop had removed his earbuds, recognizing that the conversation was becoming confrontational. "Something like that," Stella replied, her tone remaining level despite the provocation. "This is incredible," Jessica chimed in from the table. "She's actually going to stick with the mysterious military story. This is like watching someone double down on a really bad lie." Marcus finally stood up, his discomfort overriding his desire to avoid conflict. "Look, maybe we should just drop this and get back to studying," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd grown up around actual military personnel. But Brandon was too committed to his performance to back down now. He'd attracted an audience, impressed his girlfriend, and positioned himself as the voice of truth against obvious deception. In his mind, he was performing a public service by calling out what he saw as blatant military impersonation. "I mean, seriously," he continued, his voice growing louder. "The whole strong silent type thing is really overdone. We get it. You want people to think you're some kind of badass Navy veteran. But come on, you work in a coffee shop. If you'd actually served, wouldn't you have better options?" The comment struck precisely the wrong note with several customers who actually did have military backgrounds. The elderly man near the window was a Korean war veteran who recognized the signs of someone crossing a line they shouldn't cross. One of the women sharing breakfast was a Navy wife, whose husband was currently deployed with the 7th Fleet. Stella finally stopped what she was doing and gave Brandon her complete attention. For the first time since the conversation began, he found himself looking directly into her eyes, and something in that gaze made him momentarily uncertain. There was a quality of assessment in her expression that he couldn't quite identify, not anger, not defensiveness, but something that suggested she was evaluating him in ways he couldn't understand. The coordinates are 23.8859 north, 58.3794 east, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent cafe. Arabian Sea, approximately 180 nautical miles southeast of Muscat. Operational designation Triton 7. Duration, 21 days. Classification level, eyes only. The specificity of her response caught everyone off guard. These weren't the vague details someone would invent on the spot. They had the precision of actual military intelligence, delivered with the calm confidence of someone stating verifiable facts. Brandon felt his first moment of uncertainty, but Ashley's encouraging smile pushed him to maintain his aggressive stance. "Wow, that's really detailed," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Did you memorize all that for occasions like this?" "I memorized it because it was my job," Stella replied. "The trident isn't decorative. It's an operational designation. The anchor isn't symbolic. It marks a specific mission that you'll never read about in any newspaper or history book." The cafe had fallen completely silent now, with every customer focused on the unfolding confrontation. The young professional had quietly closed his laptop, recognizing that whatever was happening was more important than his work emails. The Navy wife was studying Stella with new interest, beginning to recognize something in her bearing that suggested genuine military experience. Brandon realized he'd pushed too far to retreat gracefully, but something in Stella's demeanor was making him increasingly uncomfortable. Her calm certainty was the opposite of what he'd expected from someone he'd assumed was lying about military service. Real liars got defensive, angry, flustered. They didn't respond with precise coordinates and operational details delivered in the same tone someone might use to recite their coffee shop training manual. "Look," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Anyone can memorize coordinates and throw around military terminology. That doesn't prove anything." Stella nodded slowly, as if considering his point. "You're right," she said. "Anyone can memorize coordinates. But can anyone explain why those specific coordinates matter? Can anyone describe what happened there? Can anyone tell you why 12 people went in and only 11 came back?" The last question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Brandon Mitchell found himself completely out of his depth. The silence that followed, Stella's mention of the 11th person, stretched uncomfortably long, broken only by the distant hum of the espresso machine's heating element. Brandon shifted his weight from foot to foot, suddenly aware that every eye in the cafe was focused on their exchange. What had started as casual entertainment was beginning to feel like something he couldn't control. That's a really specific story," he said, his voice lacking the confident swagger it had carried moments earlier. "But anyone could make up details like that." Stella studied his face with the kind of attention most people reserved for reading important documents. "Petty Officer 2nd Class Danny Morrison," she said quietly. 23 years old, from Portland, Oregon. Married 8 months before deployment. His wife Sarah was expecting their first child. The personal details hit differently than the coordinates and operational designations. There was something in Stella's tone, not sadness exactly, but a weight that suggested these weren't invented details pulled from imagination. She was describing someone real, someone who had mattered. Ashley sensed that the dynamic was shifting in ways her boyfriend hadn't anticipated. "Look, we didn't mean anything personal by this," she said, her earlier enthusiasm replaced by growing discomfort. Brandon was just making conversation. "Making conversation," Stella repeated, as if testing the phrase. "About military service you assumed was fake. About operations you decided couldn't be real. About people you've never met who died in places you'll never see." The elderly man near the window carefully folded his newspaper and approached the counter. His movement was deliberate, purposeful, and something in his bearing suggested he wasn't simply seeking a coffee refill. "Miss," he said. To Stella, his voice carrying the respectful tone of someone who recognized what he was hearing. "I couldn't help but overhear. Those coordinates you mentioned, Arabian Sea, southeast of Muscat. That's a busy shipping lane for commercial traffic." Stella nodded. "Yes, sir. It is. Also happens to be a route used by vessels that don't always follow standard maritime protocols," the man continued. "The kind of vessels that require specialized observation." The exchange between Stella and the elderly man carried undertones that Brandon couldn't decipher, but something about their mutual understanding made him increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't going according to his script. The barista he'd assumed was playing dress-up with military symbolism was demonstrating knowledge that seemed both specific and authentic. Tyler Rodriguez finally closed his textbook completely, recognizing that any hope of productive studying was over. "Maybe we should just apologize and leave," he suggested to Brandon. "This is getting weird." But Brandon had invested too much pride in his position to retreat gracefully. "I still don't understand why someone with actual military experience would be working in a coffee shop," he said, though his tone had shifted from mockery to genuine confusion. "I mean, don't veterans get benefits? Job placement assistance? Why would you choose this?" The question revealed more about Brandon's assumptions than he realized. In his world, career paths followed predictable patterns. College led to internships, which led to entry-level positions, which led to advancement and success. The idea that someone might choose a seemingly modest job for reasons he couldn't understand simply didn't compute. Maybe because after spending years in situations where every decision could get someone killed, there's something appealing about a job where the worst thing that can happen is someone gets decaf instead of regular. Stella replied. The Navy wife who'd been sharing breakfast with her friend stood up and walked to the counter. Her name was Linda Patterson, and her husband Commander Robert Patterson was currently deployed aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. She'd spent enough time around military personnel to recognize certain behavioral patterns. "Excuse me," she said. To Stella, "I don't mean to intrude, but my husband is Navy. The way you hold yourself, the way you scan the room, it's familiar. What was your rate?" Stella hesitated for the first time since the conversation began. Military rates were specific designations that civilians rarely understood, but they were also verifiable information that could lead to uncomfortable questions about operations that remained classified. "Intelligence specialist," she said finally. "IS-1 Cooper." Linda Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. Intelligence specialists worked in areas that most Navy families knew better than to ask about. Their deployments were often vague, their assignments frequently unspecified, and their experiences rarely discussed in detail. "That explains a lot," Linda said quietly. "My husband works with EAS personnel occasionally. They have a very particular way of processing information." Brandon felt increasingly out of his depth as the conversation moved into territory he couldn't navigate. The casual military terminology, the knowing glances between Stella and the other customers with military connections, the growing sense that he'd stumbled into something beyond his understanding. Marcus Thompson had been watching the entire exchange with mounting concern. His father's military service had taught him to recognize when situations were developing in ways that required careful handling. Brandon's continued challenges were beginning to feel less like legitimate skepticism and more like deliberate provocation. "Brandon," Marcus said firmly, "we need to stop this, now." But Jessica, still caught up in the drama, encouraged continued confrontation. "Why should we stop? If she's telling the truth, she should be able to prove it. If she's lying, someone needs to call her out." The comment drew a sharp look from Linda Patterson, who understood better than the college students the complexities of military service and the reasons why veterans might not be eager to discuss their experiences with strangers. "Proving military service isn't a parlor trick," she said coldly, "and demanding that someone justify their experiences to satisfy your curiosity is inappropriate." Stella watched the dynamics playing out around her with professional interest. The elderly veteran was clearly preparing to intervene if the situation escalated further. Linda Patterson was positioning herself as an ally, drawing on her own military community connections. Marcus was trying to de-escalate his friend's behavior, while Tyler seemed to be calculating the social cost of remaining associated with Brandon's increasingly aggressive stance. "You know what?" Brandon said, his frustration finally boiling over. "Fine. Let's say everything you're claiming is true. Let's say you really were some kind of Navy intelligence operative. That just makes it worse." "How so?" Stella asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. "Because if you really did all these important classified missions, then what are you doing here? Why are you wasting your skills making lattes for college students? It doesn't make sense." The question revealed the fundamental disconnect between Brandon's worldview and the reality of military service. He couldn't understand why someone would choose a peaceful, routine job after experiencing the intensity of special operations. The concept that someone might value normalcy over recognition, privacy over prestige, was completely foreign to his experience. "Maybe," Stella said slowly, "after years of making decisions that determined whether people lived or died, there's something deeply satisfying about making decisions that only determine whether someone gets extra foam in their cappuccino." The response silenced Brandon momentarily, but Ashley wasn't ready to let the conversation end. "That's a convenient answer," she said. "Very philosophical. But it still doesn't actually prove anything." What none of them noticed was that a new customer had entered the cafe during their heated exchange. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, wearing civilian clothes, but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. His hair was regulation short, his posture perfect, and his eyes had already assessed every person and potential exit in the room within seconds of entering. Commander David Walsh had stopped by the Pacific Coast CAF on his way to an administrative meeting at the naval base. He'd heard about a coffee shop near the base that supposedly served excellent espresso, and he'd decided to investigate personally. What he hadn't expected was to walk into what appeared to be a confrontation involving someone claiming intelligence specialist credentials. Walsh had spent 22 years in the Navy, with the last 8 focused on special operations coordination. He'd worked with enough intelligence specialists to recognize the behavioral patterns, and something about the woman behind the counter triggered his professional attention. Her situational awareness, her measured responses under pressure, her specific knowledge of operational details. These weren't characteristics that could be easily faked. As he approached the counter to place his order, Walsh caught enough of the conversation to understand the basic situation. A group of college students was challenging the barista's claimed military background, and the situation was becoming increasingly tense. "Excuse me," Walsh said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. "I'd like to order a coffee, but I couldn't help overhearing this conversation." Brandon turned to face the newcomer, hoping for support from another customer who might share his skepticism. "We were just discussing military authenticity," he said. "You know, the difference between real service and playing dress-up." Walsh studied Brandon with the kind of attention that made most people uncomfortable. I see. And what's your experience with military service? Well, I don't have any personally, Brendan admitted. But I know enough to spot obvious fake when I see it. Commander Walsh's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that Brandon had just made a serious miscalculation. Commander David Walsh took a step closer to the counter, his trained eyes moving systematically across the scene. 22 years of naval service had taught him to read situations quickly, and what he was observing didn't match Brandon's confident assertions about fake military credentials. So you're an expert on spotting authentic military service without having served yourself, Walsh said to Brandon, his tone conversational but carrying an undertone that made several customers shift uncomfortably. That's an interesting skill. Shit. Brandon sensed danger but couldn't identify its source. I'm just saying that real veterans usually have better career opportunities than working in coffee shops. It's common sense. Common sense, Walsh repeated thoughtfully. He turned his attention to Stella, and something passed between them in that moment of eye contact. IS-1 Cooper, was it? Stella nodded carefully. Yes, sir. Walsh studied her face intently, his expression shifting from casual interest to focused recognition. Intelligence Specialist First Class. That's a specialized rate. What was your NEC? The question was a test, and everyone in the cafe could sense it. Naval Enlisted Classification Codes were specific designations that indicated exact job specialties within military rates. They weren't information that could be Googled or guessed. They required actual experience within the system. 3,924, Stella replied without hesitation. Cryptologic Technician, Collection. Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly. CTR ratings were among the most sensitive in the Navy, dealing with signals intelligence and electronic surveillance. Personnel with those designations often worked on missions that never appeared in official records. Cryptologic, he said slowly. That explains the coordinates and operational details. CTR work often involves extended deployments to interesting locations. Linda Patterson, who had been following the conversation with growing understanding, moved closer to the group. Her husband's work occasionally brought him into contact with cryptologic personnel, and she recognized the careful way Walsh was asking questions. My husband works with CTR specialists sometimes, she said to Stella. He always says they see things that most people never even know happened. That's accurate, Stella replied, her tone remaining professionally neutral despite the increasingly personal nature of the questioning. Brandon felt the conversation slipping away from his control entirely. The military terminology, the knowing exchanges between people with obvious service connections, the growing sense that he was the only person in the room who didn't understand what was really happening. This is all very impressive, he said, trying to reclaim his position as skeptic. But anyone can look up military job codes and memorize some acronyms. It still doesn't prove actual service. Commander Walsh turned to face Brandon directly, and for the first time, his expression showed genuine irritation. Son, let me explain something to you about military service. The people who've actually done the job don't usually feel the need to prove it to random civilians in coffee shops. Ashley Chun recognized that her boyfriend was digging himself into an increasingly deep hole. We weren't trying to be disrespectful, she said quickly. We were just curious about the tattoo. Curious, Walsh said, his attention shifting to Ashley. About a tattoo that displays operational coordinates, classification designations, and memorial information. That's not curiosity, that's interrogation. The word memorial caught everyone's attention. Walsh had identified something in Stella's tattoo that the college students had completely missed. It wasn't just marking a location or an operation. It was commemorating someone who hadn't returned. The trident is an operational designation, Walsh continued, his voice taking on an educational tone that suggested he was correcting a significant misunderstanding. It's a memorial marker, specifically for personnel lost during classified Operations. Stella's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but Walsh noticed the subtle change. Petty Officer Morrison, he said quietly. Portland, Oregon. Married 8 months before deployment. You knew Danny? Stella asked, her professional composure cracking slightly for the first time since the confrontation began. I knew of the operation, Walsh replied carefully. Arabian Sea surveillance mission. 3-week deployment. 1 casualty during extraction. He paused. The 11 who came back all carried Morrison's information in different ways. Some kept photos, some kept personal effects. You chose coordinates and a memorial tattoo. The revelation transformed the entire dynamic in the cafe. What Brandon had assumed was fake military posturing was actually a deeply personal memorial to a fallen comrade. The cute tattoo Ashley had mocked was a permanent reminder of someone who had died in service to his country. Marcus Thompson stood up abruptly, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger, not at Stella, but at his friend's behavior. We need to go, he said firmly. Right now. Wait, Brandon protested, still struggling to process the information. How do we know this isn't all just an elaborate story? How do we know they don't just know each other and planned this whole thing? The question was so disconnected from reality that several customers actually gasped. Tyler Rodriguez buried his face in his hands, clearly wishing he could disappear entirely. Even Jessica, who had been encouraging Brandon's challenges, looked horrified at the suggestion that someone would fabricate a memorial to a dead service member. Commander Walsh's expression darkened considerably. Son, you're suggesting that this woman and I conspired to create an elaborate hoax involving classified military operations and the death of a naval service member. Do you understand how inappropriate that accusation is? I'm just saying that. It's convenient, Brandon said, though his voice had lost all confidence. Really convenient that someone with military experience happened to walk in right when we were having this conversation. Linda Patterson had heard enough. You know what's actually convenient? She said, her voice sharp with anger. The fact that you feel entitled to demand proof of someone's military service, and then reject any evidence that doesn't fit your preconceptions. The elderly veteran near the window finally spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to address military matters. Young man, I served in Korea. I've seen enough real veterans to recognize them, and I've seen enough fake ones to know the difference. That woman is the real thing. How can you possibly know that? Brandon asked desperately. Because, the veteran replied, she's not trying to prove anything to you. Real veterans don't perform their service for an audience. Walsh pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. IS-1 Cooper, what's your full name and service number? Stella Marie Cooper, service number November-7-7-4-9-2-8-1-Alpha. She replied automatically. Walsh typed the information into his phone, accessing a military database that civilians couldn't reach. After a few moments, he looked up with an expression that made Brandon's remaining confidence evaporate entirely. Stella Marie Cooper, Intelligence Specialist First Class, CTR Specialist with Cryptologic Operations, Walsh read from the screen. Multiple deployments to classified locations. Commendations for exceptional performance under hostile conditions. Medical discharge following combat-related PTSD diagnosis. The last piece of information hit the room like a physical blow. Stella's transition to civilian life wasn't a career choice or a lack of options. It was the result of psychological trauma sustained during military service. She didn't choose to work in a coffee shop because she couldn't do anything else. Walsh continued, his voice taking on a protective tone. She chose it because after years of high-stress operations in dangerous environments, she needed something peaceful. Something normal. Something that didn't involve life or death decisions. Brandon Mitchell stood in the middle of the cafe, surrounded by hostile stares and the crushing weight of his own ignorance. Every assumption he'd made had been wrong. Every challenge he'd issued had been inappropriate. Every joke he'd encouraged had been directed at someone who had sacrificed more for her country than he could imagine. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "No," Walsh agreed. "You didn't know. But instead of admitting that, you decided to attack someone based on your assumptions. That's not ignorance. That's arrogance." Stella watched the exchange with professional detachment, but something in her posture suggested she was processing emotions that went beyond the immediate confrontation. Having her service record read aloud in a public space, having her medical discharge discussed among strangers, having her memorial tattoo explained to people who had mocked it, these weren't experiences she had anticipated when she'd simply tried to work a peaceful morning shift. "Ma'am," Walsh said, turning back to Stella, "I apologize for the public nature of this discussion. These circumstances were inappropriate, and you shouldn't have been put in this position." "It's fine, sir," Stella replied, though her voice suggested it wasn't entirely fine. "No, it's not fine," Walsh said firmly. "And it's about to be addressed properly." The commander's attention shifted back to Brandon and his friends, and his expression suggested that their morning was about to become significantly more educational than they had intended. Commander Walsh straightened to his full height, and the atmosphere in the cafe shifted dramatically. What had been an uncomfortable confrontation was about to become something far more serious. His 22 years of naval service included extensive experience in leadership development, and he recognized a teaching moment when he saw one. "Mr. Mitchell," Walsh said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command, "you've spent the last 30 minutes demanding proof of military service, questioning someone's credentials, and making assumptions about veteran career choices. I think it's time you learned something about the people you've been so casually dismissing." Brandon shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that he was facing someone whose displeasure could have consequences he hadn't considered. "Sir, I was just asking questions. I didn't mean any disrespect." "Didn't mean disrespect?" Walsh repeated. "You accused a combat veteran of faking military service. You mocked a memorial tattoo honoring a fallen service member. You suggested that someone with PTSD should be grateful for whatever job opportunities they can handle. Which part of that wasn't disrespectful?" Ashley Chun moved closer to Brandon, recognizing that her boyfriend was in serious trouble. "We really didn't know," she said. "If we had known about her service record, we never would have said anything." "That's exactly the problem," Linda Patterson interjected. "You should never have said anything regardless of her service record. Making assumptions about people's military background isn't appropriate whether they served or not." Walsh nodded approvingly at Linda's comment. "Mrs. Patterson makes an important point. But since we're here, let me give you some education about what military service actually involves." The commander moved to the center of the cafe, positioning himself where everyone could see and hear clearly. The remaining customers had abandoned any pretense of minding their own business. This had become something worth witnessing. Intelligence specialists like IS-1 Cooper don't work regular deployments, Walsh began. They don't serve on ships with hundreds of crew members and regular communication with home. They work in small teams, often in hostile territory, collecting information that saves lives and prevents conflicts. Stella continued wiping down the espresso machine, but Walsh noticed her attention was fully focused on his words. He was describing experiences she had lived but could never discuss publicly. The Arabian Sea coordinates on her tattoo represent 3 weeks of surveillance work, Walsh continued. 3 weeks in international waters, monitoring enemy communications and tracking hostile vessel movements. 12 personnel went in. 11 came back. Tyler Rodriguez had been listening with growing horror as he realized the magnitude of what his study group had stumbled into. "What happened to the 12th person?" he asked quietly. "Petty Officer Morrison was killed during the extraction operation," Walsh explained. Enemy forces had detected the surveillance team's position. During the emergency evacuation, Morrison stayed behind to ensure his teammates could escape safely. He died so that 11 other service members could return home to their families. The cafe fell completely silent. Even the background hum of the espresso machine seemed muted by the weight of Walsh's words. "Stella's tattoo isn't military cosplay," Walsh said, his eyes fixed on Brandon. "It's a permanent reminder that freedom isn't free. That every peaceful morning in places like this coffee shop is made possible by people willing to risk everything. In places most of us will never see." Marcus Thompson stood up slowly, his face pale with embarrassment and anger. "Brandon, we need to apologize, right now, properly." But Walsh held up a hand, stopping the attempted apology. "Apologies are a good start, but they're not enough. You need to understand what you've actually done here." The commander began walking slowly around the group of students, his movement deliberate and commanding. "You saw someone working a service job and assumed they were incapable of anything more challenging. You saw military symbolism and decided it must be fake. You demanded proof of service and then questioned every piece of evidence you received." Jessica Wong, who had been silent since Walsh's arrival, finally found her voice. "We made a mistake. We get that now, do you?" Walsh asked. "Because making a mistake suggests you accidentally did something wrong. What you did was systematic. You identified someone you considered beneath you and decided to publicly humiliate them for your entertainment." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Brandon wanted to protest, to explain that it hadn't been malicious, but he couldn't find words that would make his behavior seem less callous. "Let me tell you what S1 Cooper has been doing for the past 8 months, Walsh continued. "She's been trying to rebuild a normal life after experiencing trauma that would break most people. She chose a job that doesn't require security clearances or operational briefings or life or death decisions. She wanted something peaceful." Stella looked up from her work for the first time since Walsh had begun his explanation. "Commander, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Walsh interrupted gently. "Because these young people need to understand the cost of the freedom they take for granted." He turned back to the students, his expression softening slightly but remaining serious. "Conflict-related PTSD isn't something you recover from quickly. It's not something that gets better with a few therapy sessions and positive thinking. It's a permanent change in how your brain processes threats and stress." Linda Patterson nodded knowingly. "My husband has friends who struggle with it. Simple things that wouldn't bother most people can trigger panic attacks or flashbacks." "Exactly," Walsh agreed. "So when someone with that condition chooses a job that allows them to function peacefully, that's not failure. That's courage. That's taking control of their recovery and building a life that works for them." The elderly veteran near the window slowly approached the group. "I came home from Korea with what they called battle fatigue back then," he said. "Took me years to figure out how to live normally again. This young lady is doing exactly what she needs to do." Brandon felt the weight of multiple generations of military experience aligned against his ignorant assumptions. "I really didn't understand," he said. I don't know what I thought." "You thought military service was like what you see in movies," Walsh said. "Heroes and glory and obvious recognition. You didn't think about the cost. You didn't think about what happens after the mission is over and the cameras stop rolling." Ashley was crying now, the full impact of their behavior finally hitting her. "We were so wrong. So completely wrong." "Yes, you were," Walsh agreed. "But being wrong isn't the worst part. The worst part is that you were cruel about being wrong. You turned someone's pain into your entertainment." Stella set down her cleaning cloth and faced the group directly. "The coordinates on my tattoo mark the last place I saw Danny Morrison alive," she said quietly. "Every morning when I get dressed, I see those numbers. Every time someone asks about my tattoo, I remember his voice calling out coordinates for the extraction helicopter. The personal revelation silenced any remaining protests or justifications. This wasn't about military protocol or service verification. It was about grief, loss, and the daily reality of surviving when others didn't. Danny was 23. Stella continued. He'd been married 8 months. His wife Sarah was pregnant with their first child, a daughter he never got to meet. When I came home and he didn't, I promised myself I would honor his sacrifice by living the kind of peaceful life he died protecting. Marcus Thompson was openly crying now, his military family background making him acutely aware of how badly his friends had behaved. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. My father served, my brother serves. I should have stopped this before it started." "Yes, you should have," Walsh agreed. "But you didn't. None of you did. You all participated in or enabled the harassment of a combat veteran." The word harassment hung in the air like an accusation none of them could deny. What had started as casual commentary had escalated into sustained public questioning of someone's military service and personal choices. "So here's what's going to happen," Walsh announced. "You're going to learn something about respect, about sacrifice, and about the real cost of the freedoms you enjoy every day." Brandon looked around desperately, hoping for some escape from the situation he'd created, but every face in the cafe reflected the same judgment. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And now he was going to face the consequences of his actions. "Commander." Walsh reached into his jacket and pulled out his military identification, placing it deliberately on the counter where everyone could see it. The laminated card bore his photograph, rank, and the official seal of the United States Navy, removing any doubt about his authority to speak on military matters. "My name is Commander David Walsh, Naval Special Warfare Development Group," he announced. "For those unfamiliar with military designations, that means I work directly with SEAL teams and other special operations units. I've spent the last 8 years coordinating missions that most people will never know happened." The introduction sent a visible shockwave through the group of college students. Naval Special Warfare was the umbrella organization that included SEAL teams, and Walsh's casual mention of his clearance level indicated connections to operations far beyond typical military service. Brandon's face had gone completely pale. "SEAL teams," he whispered. "Among other units," Walsh confirmed, "including the intelligence specialists who provide operational support for those teams." Is one Cooper's work directly contributed to missions that saved American lives and prevented terrorist attacks on U.S. soil? Stella moved to the espresso machine, seemingly focused on routine cleaning, but Walsh could see the tension in her shoulders. Having her classified work discussed publicly, even in general terms, was clearly uncomfortable for someone trained to maintain operational security. "The surveillance mission marked by those coordinates," Walsh continued, "provided intelligence that disrupted a weapons smuggling operation targeting American military bases in the region. The information collected during those 3 weeks prevented attacks that could have killed hundreds of service members." Tyler Rodriguez felt sick to his stomach. "We had no idea," he said weakly. "No, you didn't," Walsh agreed. "But your ignorance doesn't excuse your behavior. It explains it, but it doesn't excuse it." The commander began pacing slowly in front of the students, his movement calculated to maintain their complete attention. "Let me tell you what happens when someone like One Cooper comes home from a mission like that. She carries classified information that she can never discuss. She carries the memory of a teammate who died saving her life. And she carries the psychological burden of knowing that her work, while necessary, involved activities that most people can't imagine." Linda Patterson nodded grimly. "My husband calls it carrying ghosts, the weight of experiences that can't be shared with anyone who wasn't there." "Exactly," Walsh said. "And then, after carrying that burden for months or years, she finds herself in a coffee shop where a group of privileged college students decides to mock her service, and demand that she prove her worth to them. Ashley wiped tears from her cheeks, finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd done. We didn't know about any of this. We just saw the tattoo and made assumptions. Made assumptions, Walsh repeated. Based on what? What led you to assume that someone's military service was fake? The question forced uncomfortable self-reflection. Ashley realized that their assumptions had been based entirely on stereotypes and prejudices they hadn't even recognized they held. Because she works in a coffee shop, Jessica admitted quietly. We thought real veterans would have better jobs. Walsh's expression hardened. Better jobs. Define better. Jobs that pay more, Brandon said. Jobs with more status. Jobs that use their training. I see, Walsh said coldly. So you believe that someone's worth is determined by their salary and social status. You believe that choosing a peaceful, honest job over a high-stress career means someone is somehow lesser. The elderly veteran approached the group, his weathered face showing decades of hard-earned wisdom. Son, he said to Brandon, I came home from Korea and worked construction for 40 years. Was that beneath my military service? Was building schools and hospitals less honorable than fighting in them? Brandon struggled to find an answer that didn't make him sound even more foolish. No, sir. I guess I just don't understand why someone would choose a simple job if they had other options. Because, Stella said suddenly, her voice cutting through the conversation with quiet authority, after spending 3 years making decisions that determined whether people lived or died, there's profound peace in making decisions that only affect whether someone gets extra foam in their cappuccino. The explanation silenced Brandon completely. He'd never considered that someone might actively choose simplicity over complexity, peace over prestige. Walsh nodded approvingly. Combat veterans often struggle with civilian careers that seem meaningless after military service. Jobs that feel trivial compared to what they've experienced. When Cooper found work that allows her to help people in small, positive ways without the life or death pressure she carried for years. Marcus Thompson stood up abruptly, his face flushed with shame. This is all my fault, he said. I knew better. My family has military background. I should have shut this down immediately. Yes, you should have, Walsh agreed. But you were more concerned with maintaining group harmony than doing what was right. That's a leadership failure. The harsh assessment hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he didn't protest. He knew Walsh was correct. All of you participated in this harassment in different ways, Walsh continued. Brandon initiated and escalated. Ashley encouraged and amplified. Jessica supported and validated. Tyler remained silent despite obvious discomfort. Marcus knew better but failed to act. The systematic breakdown of their individual failures left each student feeling personally accountable rather than able to hide behind group dynamics. But here's what's really important, Walsh said, his tone shifting slightly. This isn't just about hurting one person's feelings. This is about the broader pattern of how veterans are treated when they return to civilian life. Linda Patterson moved closer to the group, her expression serious. Do you know how many veterans struggle with employment? How many face discrimination because employers don't understand their skills? How many choose jobs beneath their capabilities because they're tired of explaining their worth to people who've never served? Too many, the elderly veteran added. And every time someone questions a veteran's authenticity or judges their career choices, it makes that struggle harder. Stella looked up from her workstation, meeting each student's eyes directly. I chose this job because it's predictable. Customers order coffee, I make coffee, they leave. No life or death decisions. No classified information. No watching teammates die. Asterisk, the personal revelation carried more impact than any lecture about military service or veteran issues. This was a real person explaining real choices based on real trauma. The coordinates on my tattoo aren't just operational markers, Stella continued. They're the exact location where I held Danny Morrison while he died. Where I promised him that his sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. Where I decided that if I survived, I would live the kind of peaceful life he died protecting. Complete silence fell over the cafe. Even the background noise seemed muted by the weight of her words. Walsh studied each student's face, evaluating their emotional responses and determining whether his message was having the intended impact. Brandon looked genuinely stricken. Ashley was crying openly. Jessica appeared to be processing emotions she'd never experienced. Tyler seemed sick with guilt. Marcus was clearly struggling with his failure to intervene. So here's what's going to happen next, Walsh announced. You're going to learn something about making amends. Real amends, not just apologies. Brandon looked up hopefully, perhaps expecting some form of community service or charitable donation that would resolve his guilt quickly. First, Walsh said, you're going to research every aspect of military service that you clearly don't understand. Intelligence operations, combat-related PTSD, veteran employment challenges, and the transition process from military to civilian life. The assignment was clearly more comprehensive than Brandon had hoped, but he nodded acceptance. Second, Walsh continued, you're going to volunteer with veteran support organizations, not for a day or a week, but for an entire semester. You'll work with people transitioning from military service and learn firsthand what that process involves. Ashley raised her hand tentatively. What kind of volunteer work? Job placement assistance, PTSD support groups, family counseling services, homeless veteran outreach, Walsh listed. Real work with real people facing real challenges. The scope of the commitment was beginning to sink in. This wasn't going to be a quick fix or easy resolution. Third, Walsh said, you're going to write detailed letters of apology to IS-1 Cooper, but not today. Not until you've completed your research and volunteer work. Not until you actually understand what you're apologizing for. Stella shook her head slightly. Commander, that's not necessary. They've learned their lesson. With respect, ma'am, Walsh replied. They haven't learned anything yet. They feel bad about their behavior, which is a start, but feeling bad isn't the same as understanding why their behavior was wrong, or how to avoid similar mistakes in the future. The distinction between remorse and education was lost on none of the students. They were beginning to realize that Walsh intended this to be a transformative experience, rather than simply a punishment. Finally, Walsh concluded, you're going to give a presentation to your university about veteran issues and the importance of respectful treatment of military personnel. You'll share what you've learned and help educate other students about avoiding the mistakes you made today. The public nature of the final requirement clearly made several students uncomfortable, but Walsh's expression made it clear that this was non-negotiable. Any questions about these requirements? He asked. Brandon raised his hand slowly. What if we refuse? Walsh's smile was cold and professional. Then I contact your university administration, your professors, and your families to discuss today's behavior. I also file formal complaints about harassment of a disabled veteran with appropriate civilian and military authorities. The threat was delivered calmly, but its implications were severe enough to ensure compliance. However, Walsh added, if you complete these requirements satisfactorily, this incident remains between us. You'll have learned something valuable, contributed to veteran support efforts, and hopefully become better people. The choice between public humiliation and personal growth was clear, and each student nodded acceptance of Walsh's terms. But as they prepared to leave, Walsh had one more lesson to deliver, and this one would ensure they never forgot the morning they learned about real courage. As the college students began gathering their belongings, preparing to leave with their newly assigned education and community service requirements, Commander Walsh held up his hand one final time. There was something in his expression that suggested the most important part of this encounter was yet to come. Before you go, Walsh said, his voice carrying a gravity that made everyone freeze in place. "There's one more thing you need to understand. Something that will help you grasp the full scope of what you've witnessed here today." Brandon, who had been eager to escape the increasingly uncomfortable situation, reluctantly set his backpack down and gave Walsh his full attention. The other students followed suit, sensing that whatever came next would be significant. Walsh walked over to where Stella stood behind the counter, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he addressed her with the formal protocol reserved for military interactions. "IS-1 Cooper," he said, his voice shifting into official command tone. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, regardless of classification concerns." Stella's posture immediately straightened, responding automatically to the change in Walsh's demeanor. "Yes, sir." "The operation marked by those coordinates," Walsh said carefully. "The one where you lost Petty Officer Morrison. Was that Operation Neptune's Trident?" The question hit the coffee like a thunderbolt. Stella's face went completely white, and for several seconds she seemed unable to respond. The name clearly meant something profound, something that transcended the already serious nature of their conversation. "Sir," Stella said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "that operation remains classified at the highest levels." "Not anymore," Walsh replied. "As of last month, Neptune's Trident was declassified for historical analysis. The details are now available to personnel with appropriate clearance levels." He turned to address the stunned group of students and the other customers who had been following the conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh announced, "you've been in the presence of someone whose actions prevented one of the largest terrorist attacks ever planned against American civilian targets." The revelation sent shockwaves through everyone present. What they had assumed was routine military surveillance was apparently something far more significant. "Operation Neptune's Trident," Walsh continued, "was a 3-week intelligence gathering mission that intercepted communications revealing a coordinated attack plan for September 11, 2024, the 23rd anniversary of the original 9/11 attacks. Linda Patterson gasped audibly. Her husband had mentioned increased security protocols around that date, but she'd never known the specific reasons why. "The target," Walsh said, his voice heavy with the weight of the information he was sharing, "was a simultaneous bombing of 12 major airports during peak travel hours on the anniversary date. The estimated casualties would have exceeded 10,000 American civilians." Brandon felt his legs go weak. The woman he had spent the morning mocking and questioning had been instrumental in preventing a terrorist attack that would have killed thousands of people. "The intelligence collected during that Arabian Sea mission," Walsh continued, "provided the exact locations of terrorist cells in 6 different countries, the names of their operatives, their funding sources, and their detailed operational plans." Stella was gripping the edge of the counter, clearly struggling with having this information discussed publicly, even if it was now officially declassified. Petty Officer Morrison died during the emergency extraction because terrorist forces had detected the surveillance operation, Walsh explained. He stayed behind to ensure that the intelligence data was successfully transmitted to command. His sacrifice prevented the largest terrorist attack in American history. The elderly veteran near the window was openly crying now, understanding better than anyone the magnitude of Morrison's sacrifice and the burden that Stella had been carrying. "The coordinates on IS-1 Cooper's tattoo," Walsh said, looking directly at each of the college students, "marked the exact location where an American hero died saving thousands of lives. The trident symbol isn't just a memorial. It's a designation reserved for personnel who made the ultimate sacrifice during operations of national significance." Ashley Chun was sobbing uncontrollably, the full weight of their behavior finally hitting her. They had mocked a memorial to someone who had died preventing a mass casualty terrorist attack. So when you questioned whether her military service was authentic, Walsh said to Brandon, You were questioning someone who risked her life to protect every person in this room. When you suggested her tattoo was fake, you were disrespecting the memory of someone who died saving your life without you ever knowing it. Marcus Thompson buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by shame and guilt. His military family background made him acutely aware of the honor code violations inherent in their behavior. The reason S1 Cooper works in a coffee shop, Walsh continued, is because after preventing one of the worst terrorist attacks in American history, after watching a teammate die to save thousands of strangers, after carrying that burden for 3 years, she needed something normal, something peaceful, something where the stakes weren't life and death for thousands of people. Tyler Rodriguez, who had been largely silent throughout the confrontation, finally found his voice. "We had no right," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Even if she had never served, even if the tattoo had been fake, we had no right to treat anyone that way." "Now you're beginning to understand," Walsh said approvingly. "This isn't just about respecting veterans. It's about basic human decency and the humility to recognize that you never know what someone else has been through." Stella finally looked up from the counter, meeting the eyes of each student in turn. "I don't tell people about Neptune's trident," she said quietly. "Not because it's classified anymore, but because I don't want to be defined by it. I don't want people to look at me differently or treat me like some kind of hero." "But you are a hero," Linda Patterson said firmly. "You saved thousands of lives." "Danny Morrison saved thousands of lives," Stella corrected. "I just survived to tell the story." Walsh nodded respectfully. "That's exactly the kind of humility that makes someone a true hero. S1 Cooper doesn't seek recognition or special treatment. She just wants to live quietly and peacefully, knowing that she did her job when it mattered most." The cafe had fallen into complete reverent silence. Even the ambient noise seemed muted by the gravity of the revelations. "This brings us to the final part of your education," Walsh said to the students. "You need to understand that every day, you encounter people whose stories you'll never know. The barista who served your coffee might have prevented a terrorist attack. The janitor cleaning your classroom might be a decorated combat veteran. The quiet person sitting alone might have saved more lives than you can imagine." Brandon was crying now, the full scope of his ignorance and arrogance finally hitting him. "How do we live with knowing what we did?" he asked. "By being better," Walsh replied simply. "By learning from this experience and never making these mistakes again. By treating every person you meet with the respect they deserve, regardless of their job or appearance or circumstances." Jessica Wong, who had been silent since Walsh's revelations began, slowly approached the counter. "Ma'am," she said to Stella, her voice shaking, "I know an apology isn't enough, but I need you to know that I will never forget this lesson. I will never treat anyone this way again." The other students followed suit, each offering brief, heartfelt apologies that acknowledged the inadequacy of words in the face of what they'd done. Stella accepted each apology with grace, but Walsh could see the emotional toll that the public discussion of Neptune's trident was taking on her. "The requirements I outlined earlier remain in effect," Walsh announced. "But now you understand why they're necessary. You're not just making amends for being rude to a barista. You're making amends for disrespecting someone who risked everything to protect your freedom and safety." As the students prepared to leave, humbled and forever changed by what they'd learned, Walsh had one final message that would ensure this lesson stayed with them for the rest of their lives. "Remember this moment," he said. "Remember how wrong you were and how much you didn't. No, let it make you humble. Let it make you kind. And let it remind you that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unappreciated, carrying burdens you can't imagine." The college students filed out of the Pacific Coast Cafe as different people than they'd been when they entered. Their education was just beginning, but the foundation had been laid for a transformation that would affect how they treated others for the rest of their lives. But Walsh wasn't finished yet. There was still one more person in the cafe who needed to hear something important. And this message was for Stella alone. As the cafe door closed behind the last of the college students, a profound quiet settled over the Pacific Coast Cafe. The morning rush was long over, and the remaining customers, Linda Patterson, the elderly Korean War veteran, and the professional with his laptop, seemed to understand that something sacred had just taken place. They remained respectfully silent, giving Commander Walsh and Stella the space they needed for whatever came next. Walsh moved closer to the counter, his military bearing softening as he transitioned from educator back to fellow service member. The authority he'd projected while addressing the students was replaced by something more personal, more vulnerable. "IS-1 Cooper," he said quietly, using her formal designation one last time before shifting to something more human. "Stella." "May I call you Stella?" She nodded, her hand still gripping the counter edge as she processed the emotional aftermath of having Operation Neptune's Trident discussed so publicly. "I need you to know something," Walsh continued, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present during his systematic dismantling of the students' behavior. "I didn't just happen to walk into this cafe this morning." Stella's eyes sharpened with sudden attention. "Sir, I've been looking for you for 3 months," Walsh admitted. "Ever since I took over coordination of post-operation psychological support for Neptune's Trident personnel." The revelation caught Stella completely off guard. She'd assumed this entire encounter was coincidental, a chance meeting that had escalated beyond anyone's control. "The Navy has been tracking the adjustment progress of all surviving team members," Walsh explained. "Most transitioned back to active duty or accepted positions with defense contractors. A few took medical retirement, but remained within military communities. You're the only one who completely disappeared into civilian life." Stella felt her carefully constructed anonymity crumbling. "I followed all proper procedures for medical discharge," she said defensively. "I didn't violate any protocols." "You didn't violate anything," Walsh assured her quickly. "But you also didn't access any of the support services available to you. No counseling through VA programs, no veteran support groups, no contact with other Neptune's Trident survivors. You vanished into civilian life like you were trying to erase your military identity entirely." The accusation stung because it was accurate. Stella had deliberately severed all connections to her military past, seeking a clean break from the trauma and responsibility that had defined her service years. "I was trying to move forward," she said, "to build something normal." "I understand that impulse," Walsh replied. "But complete isolation isn't healing. It's just a different kind of prison." Linda Patterson, who had been listening from her nearby table, approached the counter with maternal concern. "Honey, do you have anyone to talk to about what you've been through, family? Friends? Anyone who understands?" Stella shook her head. "My family doesn't really understand military life. They know I served, but they don't know about classified operations or combat trauma. I tell them I'm doing fine, and they believe me because it's easier than asking difficult questions." The admission revealed the profound isolation that many veterans experienced upon returning to civilian life. The gap between their experiences and their families' understanding created a barrier that was difficult to bridge. "What about friendships?" the elderly veteran asked, joining the conversation with the gentle authority of someone who'd walked a similar path. "People you can be yourself with." "I don't really know who I am anymore," Stella admitted, her professional composure finally cracking. "For 8 years, I was Intelligence Specialist Cooper. I had a mission, a purpose, a team. Now I'm just someone who makes coffee and tries not to think about coordinates that mark where my friend died." Walsh recognized the symptoms of what military psychologists called identity dissolution, the struggle that many special operations personnel faced when transitioning from high-stakes, high-purpose military roles to civilian life that felt comparatively meaningless. "Stella," he said gently, "what you experienced during Neptune's Trident wasn't just combat trauma, it was moral injury. The weight of carrying information that could save thousands of lives, the responsibility of making decisions that affect national security, the guilt of surviving when someone else didn't, that's not something you process alone." The professional who'd been working on his laptop quietly closed it and approached the group. "I'm Dr. James Chun," he said, extending his hand to Stella. "I'm a psychiatrist who specializes in veteran mental health. I couldn't help but overhear, and I hope you don't mind me saying that everything you're describing sounds like textbook post-traumatic moral injury." Stella looked at him suspiciously. "Are you military?" "Civilian," Dr. Chun replied. "But I work exclusively with veterans transitioning from special operations. What you're experiencing, the isolation, the sense of lost purpose, the difficulty connecting your past self with your present life, it's more common than you might think." Walsh nodded approvingly. "Dr. Chun is one of the specialists we refer Neptune's Trident personnel to. His approach focuses on reintegration rather than just symptom management." "I'm not interested in therapy," Stella said quickly. "I just want to live quietly." "Living quietly is fine," Dr. Chun replied. "But living in isolation while carrying the psychological burden of classified operations isn't sustainable long-term. You can have peace without cutting yourself off from everyone who might understand your experience." Linda Patterson moved closer, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd supported military family members through difficult transitions. "My husband went through something similar after his first deployment with special operations. He thought he could handle everything alone, but isolation just made the burden heavier." "What changed?" Stella asked, despite her resistance to the conversation. "He started talking to other people who'd been through similar experiences," Linda explained. "Not therapy exactly, but just connection with people who understood. People who didn't need long explanations about why certain things were difficult." Walsh pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "There's a group that meets informally once a month. Other Neptune's Trident survivors, some personnel from similar operations, a few family members. No official agenda, no required participation. Just people who understand what you've been through." "I don't want to be defined by one operation," Stella protested. "You won't be," the elderly veteran said firmly. "I've been meeting with other Korean War veterans for 60 years. We don't sit around reliving battles. We talk about everything: families, careers, hobbies, current events. But we understand each other in ways that civilians can't." Dr. Chun nodded in agreement. "The goal isn't to make military service your entire identity. It's to integrate your military experiences into a complete, healthy civilian life. You can honor your service and your fallen teammate while still building something new." Stella looked around at the faces surrounding her, Walsh with his professional concern, Linda with her maternal warmth, Dr. Chun with his clinical understanding, the elderly veteran with his hard-earned wisdom. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was carrying her burden entirely alone. "What happened to the other Neptune's Trident survivors?" she asked. "Are they doing okay?" "Most are," Walsh replied honestly. "A couple struggled initially, but with support, they found their footing. One started a non-profit organization providing security consulting for humanitarian missions. Another went back to school and is now teaching intelligence analysis. They've found ways to use their skills in civilian contexts that feel meaningful." The examples offered hope that transition didn't have to mean abandoning everything she'd learned and become skilled at during her military service. "I chose this job because I wanted something with low stakes," Stella said. "After years of making decisions that could get people killed, I wanted work where mistakes just meant someone got the wrong drink order." "That's completely understandable," Dr. Chun said. But there's middle ground between life or death decision-making and feeling like your work has no meaning at all. You could use your analytical skills, your understanding of security protocols, your experience with international operations in civilian roles that matter without carrying the same level of responsibility. Walsh leaned against the counter, his formal military posture relaxing into something more conversational. The truth is, Stella, you're exactly the kind of person we need helping other veterans transition. You understand the challenges because you've lived them. You understand the importance of finding meaningful work because you've struggled with it yourself. Are you recruiting me for something? Stella asked suspiciously. I'm offering you options, Walsh replied. Part-time consulting with veteran transition programs. Occasional speaking engagements about the realities of Special Operations Service. Mentoring other intelligence specialists who are struggling with similar issues. Nothing that would compromise your privacy or force you back into high-stress environments. Linda Patterson smiled encouragingly. It sounds like they're offering you a way to help people while helping yourself heal. The elderly veteran nodded sagely. Sometimes the best way to honor the people we've lost is to help the people we can save. Stella considered the offer, weighing her desire for peaceful anonymity against the growing realization that complete isolation might not be the healthiest path forward. What about Morrison? She asked quietly. How do I honor his sacrifice while moving forward with my life? Walsh's expression softened with understanding. By living well. By using the skills he died protecting to help other people. By ensuring that his sacrifice contributed to something larger than just preventing one terrorist attack. Danny Morrison died so that thousands of people could live normal, peaceful lives, the elderly veteran added, including you. Part of honoring his sacrifice is actually living that peaceful life he died to protect. For the first time since the confrontation began, Stella smiled a small, tentative expression that suggested hope was beginning to replace resignation. The support group you mentioned, she said to Walsh. When do they meet? Third Saturday of every month, Walsh replied, pulling out a business card and writing information on the back. Informal gathering, usually at a restaurant or someone's home. Next meeting is this Saturday, actually. Stella took the card, studying the handwritten details. And if I go once and decide it's not for me? Then you don't go again, Dr. Chun said simply. No pressure, no obligations. Just an opportunity to connect with people who understand your experience. What about today? Stella asked, gesturing toward the empty cafe where an hour earlier she'd been confronted about her military service. What about those students? Today was exactly what needed to happen, Walsh said firmly. Those young people learned something. They'll never forget. They'll become better citizens, better people, because of what happened here. And you learned something too, Linda Patterson added gently. You learned that your story matters. That your service matters. That hiding your light under a bushel doesn't honor anyone, including yourself. Stella looked around the cafe one more time, seeing it differently than she had that morning. This place where she'd sought anonymity and peace had become the setting for a confrontation that forced her to confront her own isolation and consider new possibilities for her future. Commander Walsh, she said formally, I'd like to know more about those veteran transition programs you mentioned. Walsh smiled, recognizing the first step in what he hoped would be a successful reintegration process. I'd be honored to discuss them with you, Ice One Cooper. As the afternoon sun streamed through the cafe windows, Stella Cooper began to envision a future that honored both her need for peace and her capacity to help others. She would never forget Danny Morrison or the coordinates that marked his sacrifice, but perhaps she could finally begin to build a life that was worthy of the freedom he died to protect. The quiet barista who'd hidden behind anonymity and routine was beginning to remember that she was also a decorated intelligence specialist with skills, experience, and wisdom that could help other veterans find their way home from war. Sometimes, The most important battles weren't fought with weapons, but with the courage to reach out, connect with others, and build something meaningful from the ashes of trauma. And sometimes, the most unlikely places, like a peaceful coffee shop in San Diego, became the battleground where those victories were won. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.